It's my great pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Nicole Lee from the National Centre for Education and Training on Addiction. She's also the Director of Lee Gen Health Consultants. And today, Nicole will be doing a presentation that I'm sure we're all looking forward to, ICE Epidemic, Fact or Fiction. So thanks. Please join me in welcoming Nicole.
All right. So there's a lot of hype around at the moment, a lot of media. We're definitely, one thing we know for sure, we're in a media epidemic of ICE issues. And I want to just talk this morning a little bit about what the data shows us, where the problem is. There definitely is a problem, but it's not the problem that we're all hearing about. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how meth works in the brain and what that might mean for our treatment services. So just to start with, I just wanted to show you these just because they're hilarious, really funny. This is a benzodrine inhaler from the 1940s. So it works like a Ventolin inhaler. There's a little strip of paper inside and it's laced with amphetamine. This is amphetamine version as opposed to methamphetamine. And they were everywhere. There were millions of them sold. You could just buy them over the counter from a pharmacy. And in fact, you can see here from Pan Am, those of you as old as me might remember there was a airline called Pan Am before it collapsed. Just where I've circled there, you can see benzodrine inhalers. You could just get them off the service trolley with your, imagine Jetstar kind of bringing us our methamphetamine. And does this thing little pointer thing work? Yes. So the thing that makes me laugh is that the alcohol you had to pay for, but the methamphetamine you could get for free. Awesome. So it was marketed as a pick-me-up for a long flight or to help with jet lag on a long flight. That's why they have them there with the chewing gum and the toothbrushes. And these next slides are all from medical journals, so it's heavily marketed to medical professionals to fix everything really under the sun. So this one says, "Doctor, I'm tired all the time. Even the thought of beginning a day's housework makes me tired." It makes me tired as well. I don't think that's a disorder, but anyway. This one is a woman who is pregnant. It was marketed as a morning sickness cure and also to reduce weight gain during pregnancy and general weight gain and obesity kind of remedy as well. So just about everything, depression, anxiety, weight, everything. It was so we haven't always had this idea about methamphetamine clearly, and at some point after the war there was a huge influx of amphetamines into the American market, particularly. The American government freaked out a little bit, made it all illegal, and then we started with our illicit drug trade, and that's when we started to see real problems with it, of course. So what we've got at the moment is, if we have a look at what constitutes this amphetamines drug, this is how we conceptualize it. There's a group of drugs called amphetamines, and they include a whole range of different amphetamine type stimulants, excluding cocaine. So methamphetamine, which is virtually all the amphetamines on the street at the moment are methamphetamine, and they have been for quite some time, maybe 10 or 15 years. But also there's what's I think technically called levoamphetamine and dexamphetamine. So there's a little bit of diverted pharmaceutical dexamphetamine on the street, but not very much. And a bunch of other pharmaceuticals that either mimic amphetamines or are similar to amphetamines. So methamphetamine comes in three main forms. It actually comes in lots of different forms, but these are the three we see on the street mostly. Speed, which is a powdered form and sometimes pressed into pills. I went to a talk by the police in South Australia, the South Australian Police Mantle teams, who are the drug street teams, and they were showing these fantastic pictures of glow-in-the-dark pills and pills kind of pressed into transformers and all sorts of exciting things. So although it comes in a powder originally, it often gets pressed into sexy kind of pill shapes. Base, which we don't see a lot of. Actually, in Queensland, there's probably more use of base than everywhere else, but it's a paste, and it's an error in the conversion of the oil to crystal meth, which is the other form. So as we've got, when I started working, some of you know that I used to work on the 4th floor in Biella, and in the research unit, the professorial unit it was called at that time, and we started with the brief intervention study then, and at that time there was quite a lot of base around, but as we in the Royal We cooks got better at making ice, there's much less base around and much more ice around now. So this is I'm just showing you this because this is a gram of ice. That's what it looks like. That's how big it is. It's relatively small. A dependent user might use a gram or 2 a day, but most people would probably use, occasional users would probably use 1/10 or 2/10 of that in a session. So a fairly small amount. Now this is the National Drug Household Survey data. That's an interesting way to have the dates, but don't worry too much about all these lines, these wiggly lines, but just the orange one's probably the most important. This is the general population rate of use of methamphetamine from the National Drug Household Survey. The survey was undertaken in 2013, published in 2014. And so now it's kind of 2 years old. It's starting to be criticised for being out of date. So a lot of people say to me, oh, you keep going around saying that there's been no increase, but how do we know between 2013 and now? But you can see here, we've had several ice epidemics, media ice epidemics. One of them was around here, just as the trend started to drop. So media and the government were at that time saying there's been a huge increase, it's a really big problem, but actually the data in hindsight shows that that wasn't the case. There was another epidemic here, so-called epidemic, and you can see that the use has also dropped. So we don't know what's going to happen in 2016 when they do the next survey, but I'm not expecting that to change very much at all. Even if it did, I suppose, even if it doubled, say, that would be a crazy scenario. There has not been a single incident of a drug prevalence doubling in the recording of our drug use data ever. So that would be absolutely incredible if that happened. But even if it doubled, still only 4% of the population. So it's very relatively a small proportion of the population. You would have seen the NDARC brief survey that they did, that they just released, the cannabis, came out of NICPIC, that showed that most of the community thinks somewhere between 50 and 100% of the population. I don't know if they obviously didn't count themselves in that, all their ICE users are using methamphetamine, and it's just not the case. So we're talking about a low prevalence disorder, low prevalence, but so that's not to say that there's not a problem, but I'll talk to you about what the actual problem is. This line here is the 20 to 29-year-old age group. So they're obviously using quite a lot more than everybody else. They're using triple what the general population are using. So they'll be pulling up this rate, but also it's concerning that this group is using so much. The latest data, the 30 to 39-year-olds also using quite a lot more than the general population as well, but not as much as those young things. So if we drill down into that data a little bit more, we can see that at least 70% of users we would class as irregular, so they use less than once a month. Probably go out to a party, they might use, I don't know, 1 or 2 points, and then not use again for another month. So that group is not going to be dependent. It's absolute rubbish that you use once and you're completely addicted to it. It's like any other drug. Some people will go on to become dependent on it. Some people will have absolutely no problems and be using for the rest of their lives. So 70% of users have probably not dependent. They might have some mild health issues related to their use. So they might get a hangover the next day, have a bit of a crash, and I'll talk to you about why that will be in a sec. They might be having some sleep problems that are directly related. So, Monday morning, Tuesday morning, they're feeling a bit shit and they don't want to go to work. But they're much more at risk of acute harms. So overdose if they take too much, or having a bad batch or whatever. There's a group then of 15% who use once a month but less than once a week from this data. So some of those might be starting to develop some signs of dependence. They're using more regularly, especially the ones that are using kind of closer to once a week. And they might be starting to experience some mild mental health problems, but again, mostly acute harm. So harm reduction, you can see 85% of people are at risk of acute harms, but not as much at risk of long-term harm. So harm reduction for this group is absolutely crucial. And then we've got this 15% who might call regular users, who are using at least once a week. Not all of those are using daily. Some of those are using once a week. Some of them might be using a couple of times a week. But we think from other data that dependence is much more likely when you're using 3 to 4 times a week. So probably half that group are dependent on it at least. But if we said all of that group are dependents, the dependence rate's probably around 15% for this drug. That's the upshot of that. Does that make sense? So this group is going to have some long-term harms, including dependence, and some symptoms of psychosis, probably kind of ongoing psychotic symptoms. They will most likely have some symptoms of depression or anxiety, and those will be ongoing while they're using, particularly while they're using. So one of the things that we have seen in the data, although we haven't seen any increase in the number of users in the community, what we have seen is an increase in the people who already use, who say they prefer to use ice. So from 2010 to 2013, we've seen a drop in the number of people percentage of users who say they prefer to use speed, and a doubling of people who use ice. So this becomes not a problem of numbers, but a problem of severity. So people are using more ice, which is 3 to 4 times as strong as speed generally, sometimes depending on the difference between them, sometimes 7 or 8 times as strong. So we've got a drug with, existing users are switching to a form of the drug that is much more potent and is going to cause generally many more problems. The other thing that's happened in this last data, and I expect to continue to happen, is that there's a large percentage of people who have increased their use to once a week or more. So we're looking at 30% more, around 10%, 9.3 to be exact, we're using once a week or more, but now 15.5% are in the last data. So we've seen an increase in using more potent forms, but also using more frequently, using those more potent forms more frequently. Don't worry about all these squiggly lines too much, just look at the shape of them. You can see this is 2003 here, this is 2013. The data, for the unofficial data for the next year looks pretty much similar. The trend looks similar. This is purity in percentage wise, and you can see there's been a big spike in the last couple of years. So we've got people using more frequently stronger forms, and those stronger forms have increased in purity themselves. So you can see why we're starting to see lots of problems. Bunch of people who were using quietly, we didn't ever see them. They were, maybe they were dependent, even using weekly or daily. Now they're using in a completely different way, and we're seeing lots more kind of behavioural problems as a result of that. The other piece of information that we know is that methamphetamine users are really heavy polydrug users, more than any other drugs, other primary drug users. So you can see that 72% of them here use cannabis. This is the population, the light blue is the population rate of cannabis use. So it's substantially higher than the general population for all of these drugs. So they're much riskier drinkers, they're much more likely to smoke, they use a bunch of other pharmaceuticals, cocaine, ecstasy and cannabis, and although much lower prevalence, these drugs are still much higher than the general population rate. So, and as we know, if you, the more different drugs you use on top of each other, the more problems you're going to have, right? Much more likely to overdose, much more likely to have cumulative problems that are related to multiple drug use. So we've had no change in prevalence, but we've had a bit of a switch to the use of crystal meth. Frequency's increased. The purity of both speed and ice have increased. The other thing that's happened is that there's a smaller price difference between the two. So now it's more economical to buy ice than it is to buy speed because it's 3 to 4 times as strong, but the price difference isn't 3 to 4 times anymore. So if you were going to buy one of those drugs and you had a limited funds, then probably more economical to buy ice. And there's high rates of polydrug use among this group as well. So what we're seeing then is not increased use, but increased harms as a result of use. And this is borne out in all of the data. So when people present other data to support the fact that there's been a huge increase in use, what they're showing is data that supports a huge increase in problems, not in use. So we've seen in some service systems a doubling of treatment presentations for methamphetamine related problems. We've seen not a huge increase in ambulance callouts, but a little increase. So it's gone from about 3 Victorian data, which is the best ambulance data we've got in the country, they're showing about 3 call-outs a day for some type of methamphetamine to 4 now. So 1 extra a day, that's a substantial amount over a year. So we're also seeing huge increases in ED presentations for meth use, but also problems associated with that. And these treatment settings, tertiary treatment settings, ambulance, emergency, and emergency departments are going to see the pointy end. That's their job. So they are going to see an increase in the worst of the worst at that point. We've also seen a huge increase in police arrests, but I just caution worrying about that data too much because the police tell me across the country that they are targeting ICE at the moment. So if you look for something, you're going to find more of it, absolutely. And the same for customs seizures. That they're also looking out for it. They're putting more effort into it. There's more money going into that area. But it does suggest that the latest DUMA data, which is monitoring police detainees, has shown a huge increase in the number of police detainees that are using ice or meth. But again, the police are targeting that group of people. And so if you bring more people who use ice into watch house, you're going to find more ice in the watch house. It's pretty logical. So again, it's an issue of severity over numbers. Is that all okay? All right. Have I convinced you? All right. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about what happens in the brain with meth, because this tells us why we're having these problems. We can, there's, increases in use or increases in purity don't necessarily, for other drugs, translate into huge increases in problems. But for meth, it has done because of the way that meth works in the brain. So methamphetamine works mostly in the dopamine system, but it also activates noradrenaline and serotonin systems in the brain as well. But I'm just going to really talk mostly about the dopamine system. This is my other video that's not going to work, but I'm sorry for those people in webinar land. You're not going to be able to see this, but for people here, that's a synapse over there. If you have a look. If you have a look here, this is a synapse. Here, those little blue dots are meant to be dopamine. They're not actually blue. They don't really look like that. And these are receptors. On the other side, there are transporters, what are called transporters. So what happens is generally anything nice happens to us, we get a little squirt of dopamine released, and that tells our brain to do that again. Okay, so we eat a nice food, we get a little squirt of dopamine. And they go, oh yeah, I'll have that. I'll have that dinner again. That was delicious. What happens with meth is that it activates the release of dopamine. So you get huge amounts of dopamine. Some of the estimates are 1200% on baseline levels. So it's a lot of dopamine being released. So loads and loads of dopamine entering into this space here. So over there, if you can see that. And then what happens is the methamphetamine sits into these things on the other side, the transporters, and blocks them. So the methamphetamine can't be taken up again to be recycled. So what normally happens in the brain, we get a big squirt of dopamine, makes us feel really good, and then it kind of gets sucked back up into the end of this synapse and waits to be used again. But what happens with meth is huge amounts get released and then it can't be taken up again. So huge amounts are still around. So that's why it feels so great, because the dopamine is our pleasure kind of chemical and it makes us feel really good. So that's why it feels really good. But what happens then is that over a fairly short period of time, so single use time, if you have too much of that happen, your dopamine system wears out and the brain has trouble producing dopamine anymore. So that's why people have that crash the next couple of days, because their dopamine systems have kind of worn out. They're not producing enough dopamine anymore to feel good. They just feel like crap, just want to go to bed and sleep for a couple of days. And over time, if you're using regularly over a period of time, and we think that time's only about 6 to 12 months, that dopamine system wears out, not permanently, but for a long period of time. So it makes it very, very difficult to feel good about anything. Right. Sorry about that. So at low levels, this kind of dopamine system and also the activation of the noradrenaline and serotonin system. So you know that serotonin it regulates mood, but particularly it regulates optimism. So that's why MDMA or ecstasy increases levels of serotonin quite substantially. And that's why everyone is so beautiful when you're on ecstasy, and I love you, and everyone is wonderful, because it doesn't just regulate mood. You don't feel good about yourself. You feel optimistic about the whole world. And that is activated as well by methamphetamine, but primarily the dopamine system. So you feel really good, you get a lot of energy, attention's increased, alertness and memory, there's an increase in sex drive and a decrease in appetite. I was on this radio panel in South Australia a couple of weeks ago, and someone rang in and said, I'm really sure whether you've ever experienced this before, but I'm just wondering if you could comment. I work in the homelessness sector, and I'm having a lot of trouble taking assessments because I've got all these men on ice and they just want to masturbate in front of me. No, I've never had that experience, but thank you for that question. But the problem is that it does increase sex drive, but the other thing is that it decreases inhibition. So people do all sorts of inappropriate sexual things that they often regret later, or that is very unusual for them. So that was when you use a little bit, I guess. If we kind of move to the next stage where you might be using a lot, maybe half a gram or at a time, you're going to start to see some negative symptoms then. So nervousness, anxiety and panic, agitation. So have you ever seen a meth user that's on a lot of meth? They'll be, jittery and moving around all the time. You might start to see some psychotic symptoms and a bunch of physical symptoms, jaw clenching, headache, nausea, vomiting, that kind of thing. None of those are critical or require an ambulance at that point, but they're not very pleasant and constitute, I guess, a moderate level of intoxication. And then when, sorry, I went a bit overboard with the transitions. And then when we start to use too much, so we're talking about an overdose situation now, a toxicity situation. Some of the symptoms are much more severe. So we know that meth increases aggressiveness, particularly among people who already have a propensity for that. But a whole range of other unpleasant physical and life-threatening physical symptoms. So chest pain, tremor, seizure, severe headaches, difficulty breathing. You'll see people kind of walking in a funny kind of stiff way because dopamine actually acts on some of the more basic parts of our brain as well, and severe panic and psychosis. That's another video that I can't show you. Sorry. And then when people have been using for quite long periods of time, then we start to see some more entrenched kind of problems. So lots of physical effects, but particularly disturbed sleep. So you might, if you've ever had a meth user in treatment, you will see that often they don't sleep for days on end. But if they do, they'll be in a weird sleep pattern. So they'll stay awake all night and they'll go to bed at 9 o'clock in the morning and wake up at 4 in the afternoon. And so their sleep patterns all over the place. We start to see some kind of long-term psychotic symptoms, decreased motivation, depression and anxiety, a lot of weight loss. So you've seen those before and after photos, not the Star Wars version, but the actual version. Lots of that is, if you have a look at the fine print under those photos, it says may not be due to meth, because meth does reduce the need for sleep and for eating. And I don't know about you guys, but if I don't eat or sleep for a little while, I get a little bit psychotic as well, but also I don't look that great. So some of it is going to be related to some of the secondary problems related to methamphetamine. But the important thing, I think, for treatment is that we start to see some significant cognitive changes, some significant memory, concentration, planning issues. Now, this is a brain, as you can see. The red bit at the front is the frontal lobe. This kind of faded out piece in the middle, this horseshoe thing, is the limbic system. The frontal lobe in our brains, the prefrontal cortex particularly, controls our thinking processes, our higher order thinking, planning, goal setting, those kinds of thinking processes. The limbic system primarily looks after our emotional health. And you can see dopamine kind of runs down here a little bit too, but primarily the dopamine system is in the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. And it is essential for those two systems to work for themselves. So they both need dopamine to work effectively on their own, but they actually need dopamine to talk to each other. And it's essential that those two parts of the brain, it's essential that all of our parts of our brain talk to each other, but particularly these bits. What would happen normally is, I don't know, something happens to us like a cat jumps out at us and the limbic system goes, oh my God. And the frontal lobe says, hang on, just a cat. So it kind of thinks about the emotions, tells us what to do about them so we don't panic. So when those two systems aren't talking to each other, we get these huge bursts of emotion, no thinking to kind of dampen down the emotion. So this is why we see these huge outbursts of emotion, unregulated, disinhibited kind of behaviour. So the bits of the brain then that are affected affect all of these type of thinking processes: focus and attention, memory, decision making, emotion regulation because of those two pieces not talking to each other, impulse control, which is controlled by the frontal lobe, mood, which is controlled by the limbic system, and particularly for some of the behavioural problems, threat sensitivity, which is also partly controlled by the limbic system. So people become more sensitive to threat, and therefore things that we may not think are threatening, they will find threatening and react to those things, and potentially in an aggressive or violent way. So what we end up with is a whole bunch of problems in treatment particularly, but also just in life. If you can't plan or remember or have difficulty with decision making, you're going to have trouble getting to an appointment, even remembering that you've got an appointment. You're not going to be able to complete tasks. So, you know, the meth users appear to be all over the place because they can't necessarily organise themselves very well. It's very difficult to take on new information, think about the consequences or plan or goal setting, and to stop inappropriate behaviour and unexpected outbursts. So you can start to see, how many of you have treated or come across meth users? Everyone. Okay. So do these things seem familiar to you? Like I think all of our drug using clients, in my experience, have some trouble with these things. But in my experience, meth users are really difficult in treatment to keep contained because of all of these, particularly difficult to contain. So I have a client that I don't see anymore. I saw him a couple of years ago. He's my favourite meth client. I'm not meant to say that, am I? We love them all equally. But he was very bright. He was a salesperson in this top end kind of multi-million-dollar sales kind of thing. So really, really high functioning, very, very smart. We had very interesting conversations, tangential conversations during treatment. But he would do things like, he's an intelligent person, obviously in a high-end job that needed a lot of self-regulation and organising, but couldn't get himself to an appointment on time, hardly ever came to an appointment on time. He'd call me like 15 minutes into it and say, I'm nearly there, sorry, I got distracted doing something. Or someone came over and asked me for something and I thought it was only going to take 2 minutes, but it took me half an hour. So planning and thinking through and kind of working towards a goal are often very, very difficult. And it's primarily a result of those brain changes in the dopamine system kind of wearing out. And the problem for treatment is that even after 6 months of abstinence, cognition among abstinent meth users is worse than current users. So even 6 months later, their cognitive functioning is not as good as people who are actually using, because people who are still using are still getting some of the benefits that we saw with mild intoxication of increased concentration as well as the cognitive deficits. And the data that we have from brain studies shows that there's no significant improvement in 12 months after abstinence. So we're talking about a really long recovery time. We think probably somewhere between the 12 and 18 months, the brain starts to recover after abstinence, but it's a really long time to stay on the wagon, not relapse, in order to get to that 12 to 18 months significant improvement time. So here we see in a more acute withdrawal, we can see that heroin and alcohol withdrawal usually 5 to 7 days. Anyone work in a withdrawal unit? Would that be Is that your experience? Around 5 to 7 days. All our services are funded for 7 days. But you can see meth users, they have a bit of a crash for the first couple of days. Their symptoms start to peak at 5 days when we're just about to release them out of detox. And then they, their symptoms start to resolve to a kind of lower, normal level um, around day 13 or 14. So we've got a doubling of even the withdrawal recovery time, and we're not very well set up for that in our treatment services. We discharge people 5 to 7 days. Um, for meth users, they're still in withdrawal, and as a result of that, nearly 100% of them relapse straight after withdrawal if they don't go on to anything else. And this is a really big problem for us. Okay, so this is data that we collected probably around 2011 and published in 2012. And we just really, it's not very highly scientific, but we just asked people who were in treatment. So these are dependent meth users. So these are people who have gone on to have problems, they're in treatment. When they first started using, so it's an average of 19.9 years, which is consistent with the National Drug Household Survey data. It's a little bit higher among the general population. I think it's about 21. And they first began to have problems about a year later. And that's consistent with my clinical experience as well, that people, if they're going to develop problems, it'll be in the first year of using regularly. The next piece of important information is that the first problems occurred around 21, and the first mental health symptoms started around the same time. So that suggests to me that meth is actually driving the mental health symptoms rather than the other way around. There are going to be people who have a primary mental health disorder that will be using meth, but you can see that mental health problems seem to be related to when people start using regularly. And this is important for us because if we treat the meth problem, then the mental health symptoms will probably go away because they're related to using meth. And that is also consistent with data from brain studies, which show the increases in dopamine. Huge increases in dopamine have been just generally been related to psychotic symptoms and psychotic disorders, and depletion of dopamine is related to depression symptoms and depressive disorders. So you can see when there's lots of meth on board, lots of dopamine, we start to see these psychotic symptoms reduce. When we wear out the dopamine system, we start to see these depression symptoms. So they're pretty closely related to the actual meth use. But the problem thing for treatment is that it takes 5 years or more from the first problems and first mental health problems for people to come into treatment. So we've got people running around with quite severe problems, lots of mental health issues, without any access to treatment or without coming into treatment. So it's a long time to be unwell. And so by the time we see them in treatment, they're quite unwell, they're quite severe, and it makes it much harder to get. But we do have good treatments for methamphetamine problems. We have some relapse prevention. It just looks like every other relapse prevention for every other drug use, so it's not anything different. But actually here at Biala we did a brief intervention study with Amanda Baker. We collected data from Queensland and from Newcastle, New South Wales. We trialled a 2-session or a 4-session intervention. We found that both of those, only 2 sessions was effective. So you don't need much treatment to increase abstinence among this group. And that's my clinical experience as well. They're very, very reactive to treatment. Once they come into treatment, you can pretty much throw anything at them and they're good to go. The problem is staying off. Residential rehab, the MATE study from Rebecca McKeaton, if you're interested in finding more about that, showed that resi rehab is effective in increasing abstinence, but you'll see in a minute that the relapse rates are very, very high from treatment, and after 3 years, people who've been through resi rehab look exactly the same as people who've had no treatment at all. So it's not a really good treatment scenario. But so what we've got, sorry, I'll just finish this slide. There's no pharmacotherapy that's effective in increasing abstinence, but we use pharmacotherapies for symptom reduction, and that's the general recommendation. And withdrawal, as we saw before, there's virtually no benefit of withdrawal unless you go on to something else afterwards. So this is the rate of relapse in the MATE study of people in resi rehab. 87% after 3 years have relapsed. So they look pretty much like people who've never had any treatment. So we're trying to balance this unusual situation where very brief treatments are effective, but there's this really long recovery time and huge relapse rates. Right? So at first, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but I'll tell you what I think about that in a second. There's another piece of research that's been done in Victoria from Turning Point. It's called the Pathways Project, if you want to have a look at that. The two things that they found were predictive of lower levels of relapse or better outcomes was completing resi rehab. So that's a little bit different from the MATE study, and I'll tell you what I think about that in a sec. But also attending mutual support groups, so Smart Recovery, AA, NA, that kind of thing, or other groups that are, people can regularly access. So I think if you put all of that data together, if you don't just look at one or two pieces of it, you put all that data together, what this is telling me is that we need some brief interventions. That's all great. That's really good to know that you only need to throw 2 or 4 sessions at someone and they will probably get better. And this suggests that some type of longer term follow-up is required. If you put it together with the MATE study that shows 90% relapse out of rehab, suggests that the rehab itself isn't the thing that's helping. It's the continuous follow-up that's associated with rehab. So people in rehab for a year, they've got support for a year. Doesn't necessarily mean that this long-term intensive intervention is the most effective way to go for this group. That's just data that shows the MATE study. You can see at 3 months they're doing pretty well from resi rehab, but even by 1 year, they've pretty much, there's a 78% relapse rate here, and there's something like a, 92% relapse rate here. So there's not really that much difference even at 1 year. So we need to capture people in that first 12 months, provide some extra support, not necessarily intervention, but some type of support so we can bring them back into treatment early before they start to relapse. So my reading of this is that it is a drug that's relatively, a lot of problems with it. It's relatively easy to get off in terms of, we know quite a bit about withdrawal. We know that brief intervention is effective, but it's really difficult to stay off. So we need to really orient our services a little bit better, and we're not funded to do aftercare at all, are we? It's either intensive treatment continually or nothing. So we need to think of ways that we can support people in a low intensity kind of way in the community so that they can re-access treatment when they need it, but they're provided the support that they need to stay off the drug as they're going along. And so some of this might be to do with support groups or accessing kind of lower level interventions that don't require a huge funding base but are still available with professional help and links into treatment as required. I love this picture, an encounter group, holding hands. But for you counsellors out there, I found this accidentally and didn't realise, but this is Carl Rogers here, the counselling guru. Hello. Okay. That's the last slide. Oh, I thought there was another one after that. Thank you. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
Oh, we do have some questions coming in from Webinar Land, if you're happy to take those now, and
Absolutely.
then we'll go to the floor next as well.
Okay.
Okay, so we've got quite a few. As you can tell, it's been a popular webinar. So let's just go with this one first. Do we know the impact ice has on the development of the unborn child, and how do we support the baby once born? That's one of the questions.
That's a really good question. We know a little bit about that area. Most of the documented harms to the fetus are around not so much about the cognitive problems, a little bit different from alcohol related problems among babies. Most of the documented problems are around early miscarriage, death of the fetus, stillborn babies, that kind of thing. So it's a really high risk for pregnant women who are using in terms of not not going through to full term. Yeah.
And this is another question, what are your thoughts on the theory that the current media-driven ice epidemic is a well-orchestrated distraction
No.
implemented by a conservative government away from alcohol-related harms, which prior to the announcement of a national ice task force was only just beginning to gain the national attention it deserves?
Yes. Thank you for that question, whoever that was. Yes, I do have some views about this. I'm not I guess I'm not so prone to the conspiracy theory idea, but there's certainly you will remember that just prior to this ice problem, we had a lot of focus on alcohol, king hits, people being violent on alcohol. We've completely forgotten about all of that. And I mean, if you look at all the data, I've just shown you meth data today, but if you compare it to alcohol data, it's a speck in the ocean, a drop in the ocean, sorry, mixed metaphors. So I think that we would do well to respond to this meth problem. There obviously is a bit of a problem here, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that alcohol is still by far our biggest issue in terms of harms to self and others, deaths, morbidity, and ambulance call-outs are still, the Victorian data show that ambulance call-outs are something like 40 a day for alcohol and 4 a day for methamphetamine. So, we need to keep it in perspective. And I think it's a real shame that we have lost sight of that. But I'm hoping that we can kind of zoom back and see the bigger picture very soon.
Thank you. This is another question from the webinar land. This came up earlier when you were discussing the effects on the brain. The question was, we have an understanding that methamphetamine loses its effect quickly. So why does the euphoria wear off so quickly if the dopamine reuptake is inhibited?
Because my understanding is, and I should say I'm not a neuroscientist, so the technicalities of this escape me, but my understanding is because it quickly wears out that dopamine system and we cannot produce any more dopamine, or the dopamine levels that are produced are very, very low. So we end up seeing, yeah, so the effects are related to low levels of dopamine.
Great, thank you. We might take questions from the floor. Jeremy?
Thanks very much, Nicole. I just wondered if you comment about the distribution of users. It's clearly young people who are the most frequent users. What about rural as against metro? And why do you think there is this marked difference or discrepancy?
Yeah, so there's a couple of pieces of data that are really interesting around that from the National Drug Household Survey. One of those is around rural and regional differences. So overall, there's going to be pockets in various places, so I just make that caveat. But overall, most methamphetamine users are in cities, so about 70% of them live in capital cities. And that's the first piece of information. The second piece is that inner regional areas, so we're talking about, here, Toowoomba, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, those kind of inner regional areas, they show a lower level of use than the general population. And it's the really remote areas that are showing higher rates of use in populations. My guess is that some of that's driven by some of those remote Aboriginal communities that are having really significant problems with meth. And when you've got quite a closed community that's not accessible or not connected with other places, very, very far away from other places, then you're going to see it's kind of like a microscope. Meth comes into a community like that, and it's going to spread much more quickly, and it's going to be much more visible. So that's so in terms of regional rural differences, I think we should still remember that most people who use are still in cities, but people in outer regional areas are twice as likely to use meth than people in cities or inner regional areas, but they're also twice as likely to use just about everything else as well. So this is a situation that's an issue of regionality, not of meth. It's a problem that's across a bunch of drugs in outer regional areas. The same goes for the unemployment status of people. So most meth users are employed, about 65% of them are employed. So that means the workplace is a really important kind of place that we need to look at for recruiting people for intervention and harm reduction. But aside from that, people who are unemployed are much more likely to use ice than speed, about twice as likely, and they're much more likely to use methamphetamine more generally, twice as likely if you're unemployed. Is that making sense? Those two pieces seem contradictory, but again, unemployed are twice as likely to use just about every other drug as well. So it's a problem with unemployment, not a problem with methamphetamine.
Oh,
Hi.
great to see you back on full floor
Yes,
again.
thank you, Anthony.
And thank you for that clarification around severity rather than prevalence. I think that was a really interesting point. I just asked a question about I think, a representation of what you were talking about in terms of the dopamine depletion and that being a long-term situation. I had a client who was able to cease using for a short period of time, but really struggled with the fact that the world was then grey. Nothing's exciting anymore. So we were not seeing depression here. We were seeing a man who was functioning reasonably well, but pleasant activity scheduling did nothing for him because it still was. It didn't mean anything to him. It wasn't anywhere near as exciting as his meth life was. What do we know in terms of particular interventions that can assist with someone for whom we know maybe 12 months down the track it might take before the world starts looking colourful again?
Yeah, this is the biggest problem, I think, clinically for relapse, that the dopamine system is so worn out. There's that piece of it, but also the acute effects of meth in the first few uses are so phenomenal that absolutely nothing will come close to it ever again. That's just, I think that some of that is acceptance that that life is probably going to be a little bit grey after that. There is nothing that's going to be that great ever again. So I don't know the exact answer to that, Anthony. It's a really good question. There's not a lot of research in that area. Our CBT study showed that symptoms of depression, which also included at the lower level, like melancholy and, greyness, I guess, if you, 2 sessions increased abstinence, but 4 sessions also decreased depression. So we know that a little bit more treatment around depression, just our usual depression treatments, can help with that. There's been a bunch of pharmacotherapies that are serotonin increases and that respond to the dopamine system, and those have shown absolutely no benefit really to users in the long term. Aside from reducing depression symptoms in the short term. So that's probably not an avenue for treatment. I personally am really interested in mindfulness and acceptance type therapies that can help people reframe and cultivate kind of the pleasure of just being. Yeah, but we've not really had any interventions that have been tested in that light. There's been one small study in South Australia looking at Acceptance and Commitment Therapy Act. It showed no benefit over the brief intervention study so they had a brief intervention comparison using the intervention that Amanda Baker and I developed, and they were equal outcomes. So it didn't really enhance the treatment at all, but it means it's another avenue. But I think I'm really interested in mindfulness and compassion and those kinds of things, and whether that will show some benefit for that group. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but yeah, thank you for that question.
Thanks, Nicole. Just a couple of quick questions from the webinar. Participants are looking for a bit of guidance on where they might be able to find localised statistics, and I'm guessing on maybe usage rates or...
Yes, so the National Drug Household Survey does produce data on local, not down to the LGA level. You can access that if you've got money, but they do publish Queensland data for state and territory data on the same thing. The Queensland data looks pretty similar to the general population data. There's a couple of places like Tasmania and Northern Territory that have higher rates of use than everywhere else. WA has a lot higher rate of use than everywhere else, but Victoria and New South Wales have lower rates than the general population, the 2.1%, and Queensland's about on par, and South Australia's about on par.
Another final question, asking for, again, a little bit of direction in relation to any studies or literature regarding the impact of ice use during pregnancy, if you're aware of anything that's available.
I do have some of that literature. So if anyone wants to contact me for anything in terms of, bits of research and papers, you're quite welcome to do that, and I'll send you some stuff. Oh, but I should say, if you want to have a look yourself, we did a piece of work for NADA, which is the QNADA equivalent in New South Wales, and we did a needs analysis and a lit review of women's services. So it wasn't about meth, but it does contain some information about drug use during pregnancy, including methamphetamine. So you could that's on their website.
Great, thanks so much for that. Any final quick questions from the floor? Because we're going over time. Please join me in thanking Associate Professor Nicole Lee very much. Thank you. And if you can fill out your surveys, webinar land, we'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you.